Well, welcome one and all to Sunday Forum. This week is a first in a two-parter as we continue to explore some of the current advancements in understanding the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. And gosh, a lot has changed over the years. And I was also thinking about how much this congregation has actually been affected by dementia. And in particular, it's kind of where this thought around this forum came up in conversation with Pastor Lori. Today, we welcome Spokane neurologist Dr. David Greeley. Thank you for being here today. He's going to present an overview of dementia and the current state of treatment. Next week, we are going to be welcoming Hyunki and Norm Thorpe and Hulda Bridgman, who are going to speak in a panel both from their experiences as patient and as caregivers dealing with Lewy body dementia. So thank you very much, Dr. Greeley. I'm going to turn it on over to you.
Thank you, Lester. So I'm going to keep this very informal. I may even sit down at some point if you can see me. But I kept it just a one-sheet thing because I could sit here and talk all day. But there's 45 minutes?
Yeah.
So we'll try and leave a lot of it for question and answer. And I always say that, and I always say it's a big enough group that, again, we can have it be very conversational. But at the same time, remember when you ask questions, try and keep the questions to what everybody would want to hear, because sometimes it gets sidetracked to my uncle or my friend or my neighbor, and that is not always the best way to get a big conversation going, to make it unique to one individual. So I'm talking in big generalities today, because that's what you have to do, I think, because I think people don't realize how big a category this is sometimes. I think people think that dementia is when somebody is demented, and when we say demented, that usually means incapable of doing anything for themselves and completely dependent on others, and that's a very late stage of what I'm talking about, and there's really very little that I can do as a neurologist at that stage. So I'm trying to encourage people to come to see me long before they even actually probably believe it is dementia, and that's a tough thing to get people to admit, because, and I start out just like the stages, the first one's memory loss, and basically everybody in the room has memory loss. I mean, we all do, and that's okay. I mean, in fact, when you study somebody who has a photographic memory, they are much more disabled than they want to be. It's very difficult to have photographic memory, and even to not be able to give up memories is what we do as babies, and we don't know that, but we're losing and shedding so much memory that even talking to somebody has something quite huge happen in their life. We were talking to my oldest daughter, and we were in London for training for 3 months, and she has no memory of any of it because she was only 18 months old.
Sure.
And it was huge to her, we would think, and she could do so much and talk and point and talk about things that happened a week ago, but it's absolutely gone in her brain, because as far as you can ask her, I mean, there's something there, and there's something certainly formative in all of us for those first few years, but we're clipping and pruning and getting rid of so much at that stage, because it would be dangerous to be able to react like a baby to every single thing that comes our way. And you put a baby on a cold surface, and it just makes them go bonkers, because it activates so many neurons and creates so much that you would be overwhelmed. So again, we have to be happy, I think, to know that we're actually forgetting things all the time, because you don't get overwhelmed with issues. And the other thing that people don't realize is actually it's much tougher to lose a memory as we get older than people think. And in fact, kids can lose memories as a young person. They just aren't disturbed by it. They aren't frustrated by it. And so, because they're learning so much again, they have to be able to learn how to put things into a file cabinet. And if you're actually good and smart and you're attending, you're putting things into a file cabinet all the time, and you're trying to adjust and compare it. So when I go and I meet somebody and they say, "Hi, I'm Bob," I'm like, dang, and I've already had 30,000 or 3,000 Bobs in my life, and it's very complicated to figure out where to put that new Bob in my file cabinet that's got a lot of Bobs. And so the next week when I go to meet Bob, I'm like, oh, because it just doesn't sound right, because it wasn't that unique. Whereas The first time you meet a Bob, you know, as you're a 5-year-old or something, you might think it's funny, you're, oh, Bob, because it sounds like you're in the water, or, you know, bobbing around, or I don't know, you can make some memory to it that's so unique that you'll never forget it. So we actually make much more solid memories and much more bonding memories when we're young, but it's actually tough to lose memories as we get older, and learning how to get rid of things actually helps us to recall the things that are important, if that makes sense. So again, there's a big difference between making a memory and then actually recalling it and pulling it back out of a big, dense file cabinet. So we talk about memory loss, we all have that, we can all live with that. What starts to be a problem is if you go from the memory loss to where you get some impairment. And that just means it could be a slowing down or an inability to do something you've done before, either socially or if you're still working occupationally, but that's the definition of dementia. I mean, at that stage where you have really had memory loss that's impairing your function, you already have dementia. I don't want to hear that ever, and I don't try and use that word, because again, society's given it a connotation of such, again, late stage and such evil and such dependence that people will argue with me if I try and push it, and there's no real point to. But just technically, by definition, you can see, and that can be just, again, a slowing down or impairment. So, I mean, I think, not to pick on her, but my mother-in-law now is at a stage where no one would have any doubts on a lot of things that she does. But when you're first starting to change, you don't want to be mean, but sometimes it's just they don't want to go out like they used to, or they don't want to do things, even if it's to go to church, or they may not want to go to a book club, or they may not want to go to a movie or even out to dinner, because it's anxiety provoking, it's situational, and people know they're going to be put on the spot, and they're smart enough to know they're making mistakes, or they're not as quick, or they're going to forget Bob's name. And that, you know, people don't want to be embarrassed. We're all, you know, most of us at least don't want to be embarrassed in front of others. And so it's something that then that anxiety and frustration, and all of us know when we're anxious how tough it is to remember something. And so the anxiety just makes it worse. So anxiety is part of this disease, and it's part of the same organ system that we're studying in neurology. And I think that, again, there's been a more and more merging of neurology and psychiatry as time's gone on. It was separated at a time when it made sense. And I think arguably Freud was the one who really split it, because he really had a fascination with more of the psychiatry end, if you will. But most everything from anxiety to depression to schizophrenia can be imaged and or chemically tested. And so these, you know, people have something. And I think to belittle it and say it's only psychiatry, it's only in the mind, is belittling and mean, because they're real diseases, and they're as real as anything I take care of in neurology. And so I try and never forget that I'm taking care of somebody's anxiety and or history and or what made them who they are, as much as any psychiatrist. And I really hope psychiatrists try and take care of the brain that they're taking care of as well, but they use a lot of the time very potent neuroleptic or antipsychotic medications that truly change brain chemistry, and people start to become Parkinsonian or neurologically impacted by their diseases. And it's surprising to me how often psychiatrists don't think about that. But again, that's going off on a tangent. I think, again, if you just look, again, no one needs to raise their hand, but there are stages, even myself, where I have to take notes more than I used to. I don't think I could go back and first have an interest in going back to medical school or do as well in medical school if I were to go back. You know, is that really, do I have dementia? I mean, no, it's not really impaired my function, but I would need to do more, and I would need to take more time. And I'm comfortable with that. Again, half of it is just realizing that we can't live forever, and we do have to have some impairment. I would like to think, and most of us would like to think, that we can get to a stage where we gracefully die, you know, in our sleep at some age that is always 10 years older than we are, and then we've had time to reconcile and, you know, talk to our loved ones. So I think those are things that, again, that's the dream, and unfortunately it doesn't always happen that way. And again, you guys in this room and in this building know more about why there's a plan or who actually designed it, and that's complicated. But I think when you look at it all, the trick is, and this is where, again, I think and what we have to offer in neurology and in healthcare today is much more in prevention, and I'm not even talking about that today, but there are things that, again, if you do and think, the things that will make me happy and healthy in life are probably going to be things that help almost every organ system, including the brain. And I can't say enough about that. I always look and think about Lou Gehrig, who somehow, in the middle of a devastating illness of his neurological system, was able to stand up in front of Yankee Stadium and say, "I'm the luckiest man alive." And to be able to do that showed that he had an understanding of the situation, and we all are humans and we're never going to get out of this alive. I mean, something's going to happen, and to be able to take that on made it certainly easier, I suspect, on the people that were with him. You know, he didn't want to stop playing, but he knew he was going to have to stop playing the game someday. And again, we're all going to have to stop playing this game someday, and we just have to, I think, come to terms with that. So I think coming to terms with it and addressing it and taking care of it, just like thinning hair or a leaky roof. I mean, the sooner you get to it, the more likely you are to be able to help it. So when it gets to though, then people say, well, what's the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's, or dementia in any type of dementia? So the dementia is just the category. Again, that's just saying you have an impairment in function associated with memory loss. And the most common in this country, in most first world countries, is Alzheimer's disease. And so what is that? Well, we now have the ability to actually test through either a scan, a PET scan, or a lumbar puncture and test your cerebrospinal fluid, or even now blood tests that aren't FDA approved but are being able to be done. We can actually tell somebody has what's called amyloid pathology, or amyloid plaque in their brain. So if you have memory loss, like we all do, and you have some impairment in function, and you have amyloid plaque in your brain, with no other reason to explain it, you do have Alzheimer's disease. Now, technically, there are people who could have Alzheimer's disease literally from birth, because they unfortunately got a gene. That's very rare, but they could have the disease, but they would have no memory loss at that stage, technically, and they would not have any impairment, but they technically could say they have Alzheimer's disease because they do have it. And it's, maybe again, all of us can think we all have some early stage of cancer or heart disease. I mean, again, that's morbid to sit around thinking about all the things that could be coming, but you can have the disease before you get dementia. And technically, we all do. Before we get dementia from Alzheimer's disease, we had the disease. And the plaque is probably there, they think, they, meaning me and others, 20 or 30 years before you get symptoms sometimes. So this is a slow-moving disease. And again, a thing that I think makes us realize when you talk to people about it, like hair loss or gray hair, things that you don't notice yourself sometimes even, but somebody who hasn't seen you in 10 years instantly would notice that you've got thin hair or gray hair or memory loss. And it may be so obvious to somebody who hasn't seen you in a while and has been so slowly moving on. So again, I think a lot of people think this is a rapid and devastating disease, but 9 out of 10 times that's because people are looking at it so late that there's just not much room to change, and it's already been going on for many years. So we want to see people in those 10 to 20 to 30 years if we can. So it could be any of us, including me, that are having the disease already. And if you have the amyloid pathology, which is testable, it's called Alzheimer's disease. And you've heard other things already. And I've got on this list, if you actually do the testing and you have Lewy bodies in your brain, that is a different pathology, and a lot of these disease states have the same, we don't know what causes any of them, really, and whoever figures that out will get a Nobel Prize, because all these diseases have a similar thing where the brain starts to deposit an abnormal protein in the brain, and we don't know why it's doing it, and it's probably some reaction to something, again, 10 or 20 years earlier, but it starts putting this amyloid plaque in, that's called Alzheimer's. Or it creates these things called Lewy bodies, L-E-W-Y, and you get a thing called dementia with Lewy bodies. Or Parkinson's disease, they both have Lewy bodies. Or as I said, you can have multiple head injuries and get a thing called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, which is again another thing that would cause memory loss and impairment. Or you could have Down syndrome and get pathology very similar to Alzheimer's disease in your brain. Or you've drank too much alcohol in your life and you get alcoholic dementia. Or you've had too many strokes from heart disease or from risk factors for heart disease and stroke and get vascular dementia. I mean, in the end, just to be honest, the bottom one, mixed dementia, is what 4 out of 5 people have. There's very rare times where somebody has just Alzheimer's disease and they've never had a head injury, they've never had a drink of alcohol, they're not depressed, they don't have anything else. That's rare. I mean, most of us have a mixture because we're humans and we all have had things happen to us in our lives, but we're looking for that pure case, for research, and we can sometimes find it better than others, but for the most part, there's always some degree of mixture, and that's why I listed. So we can talk about all of that. I want to leave, again, plenty of time for discussion. What I wanted to encourage those people is not to be too depressing and just talk about all the downsides, but again, if you come in early, we do now have, and have for 30 years, FDA-approved medication for Alzheimer's disease. And they're symptomatic, meaning that they help symptoms, which is good. I mean, they again will help you with your ability to orient and know where you are. They'll be able to help you to remember things. They'll be able to help you to balance your checkbook or go to the store or without a shopping list and be able to come home and make a meal for 6 like you always were able to, or be able to do your laundry or learn how to use a remote. You know, all those things that drive us crazy, and you watch kids do it. Sure.
I don't mean to interrupt. Well, my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, the medications available now slow the progression. They don't improve things. It's just slowing the progression, or?
Yeah, that's a good, I'm glad you brought it up, and I didn't plant her, even though I know her. And that's actually what almost every doctor will say. But in
Okay.
all honesty, and they're not intending to lie to you, but they
Right.
don't know how fast it's going, so how on earth do they know
Oh, okay.
whether they're slowing it down? And
Sure.
it's a thing that I think people it's very comforting to hear that, and so doctors have come to use that phrase, but I try not to, because unless I know how fast it's going, I really would be lying to you about the fact that I'm slowing it down. In the same sense, like, if I have heart disease, people give me medication for that. I'm not thinking, is it gonna slow my heart disease down? I mean, just treating it.
Yeah.
Or diabetes, or my thyroid, or cancer. I mean, you're not really slowing it down in almost everything we do in healthcare. We're just treating it. But there's something, and I'm not trying to be uncomforting, but there's something comforting in the thought that you're slowing it down. But technically, no, it's just treating symptoms. And we don't know enough about those drugs because they were never studied that way, but they don't do anything to the disease. So these symptomatic drugs I've listed that have been around for up to 30 years, they treat symptoms, and they, again, help in a lot of ways. So if you go back up here, I've had patients who are now able to live independently. It's avoided their need for assisted living. It's avoided their need for a caregiver. It's avoided their need for their daughters to annoy them all the time. You know, I mean, they live independently for sometimes 5 or 10 years. So that's what's important, I guess, to us. But I can't say if it's really actually done a dang thing to their disease. And in fact, most of the time for the past 30 years, we've never actually known for sure they had Alzheimer's disease. It was a good guess.
Right.
And so to really actually know I was slowing down the disease when I didn't even know they had it wasn't fair. But I try not to, beyond this, without explaining it, I don't try and change their view, because it's certainly nice and comforting to think you're slowing things down. Just like if you're treating heart disease, you are slowing down their risk of future heart attack, or you are making diabetes less likely to be bad down the road. But that's what really helps, is that these drugs, if you take them early, you're going to be doing better 5 to 10 to 20 years from now, and so it's worth taking. Maybe in an analogy like doing an oil change for your car. I mean, sometimes you're not even know it did anything, but they tell us it's good to do, and you just do it, and it hasn't really hurt other than having to do it. But people who do that, they live longer, their cars last longer, it works. And that's sometimes, I think, the way to look at it.
Did you mean to infer when someone could live independently that their symptoms were reversed, that they couldn't live independently, they took these drugs and now they can live independently? I just wanted to clarify what you were saying.
It depends on where somebody's at, but no, I've certainly had people that were on the verge of moving to assisted living. If they got much worse, they would have that need, and then the drugs make them better. I mean, Aricept or donepezil for 30 years has made people better. Not everybody, but enough people that it's worth trying. And once you're on those drugs, I don't think there's a real reason to ever stop them in your lifetime, as long as you're taking medication for anything, because I think, and I'm highly biased as a neurologist, but I think it's the most important organ, and I think it's the organ that gives us quality of life. And so why would you stop taking the thing that gives us a quality
So
of
it
life?
can change the course of where you otherwise would be. That's what I was trying to clarify.
Yes,
Yeah.
and so in the sense that it changes the course, I
Yeah.
think that it feels like that's changed the disease, but
Well,
I can't
it's
say
changed,
that.
yeah. I mean, I'm just, again, I get it that it's symptomatic, but I was trying to say if you go down the path of having symptoms, can it like pull you back from that path and offer you another path that is more independent? So-
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. All right.
And I mean, not, again, if people have to a point where they have significant dependence on others, it's only gonna make them less dependent.
Got it.
But if you're at a stage where you're teetering, or you just need a little help, it can get you back to where you're independent.
Okay.
So they're not miraculous drugs, but they help.
Yeah.
And because of that, they got FDA approved, and there are 3 different companies that all made the same kind of drug, and that's the donepezil, ribostigmine, and galantamine. They're all very similar. I don't think one's better than another. Subtly, one might be better than one for another, but I would say it's like Coke, Pepsi, and Shasta. So, I mean,
Works for that person.
Yeah, yes, for that person, and that person who loves Coke will go around and tell everybody it's the best, but, you know, a real Pepsi fan's like, yeah. So that's it, they're all good, but they're not curative, at all. And so that was why there's been frustration. There's been years gone by where we really haven't done anything for the disease. In a lot of physicians' minds and researchers' minds, we weren't treating the disease, we were just treating symptoms, and the drugs were only so good. And so then the past few years, there has been now a push to actually, well, past 30 years, there's been a belief that because amyloid is there, and it's part of the definition of the disease, if we remove that amyloid, we would help people. But in basically the history of Alzheimer's disease, there's never been a drug until 3 years ago that ever proved that. And a lot of companies tried to get rid of amyloid and it didn't help. So a lot of people like me were frustrated that so much money was being spent on one specific area of Alzheimer's disease, which was to remove amyloid plaque. And my analogy for this, and you can see I like analogies, but it's kind of like coming upon America and finding out there's a lot of heart disease centered around these buildings that have golden arches. and saying, hey, I found there's a lot of garbage outside of these golden arches. They produce a lot of garbage every day. Let's get rid of that garbage and we will help heart disease in America. And you spend 30 years doing it, you finally clean up all the garbage, and hey, there's still just as much heart disease. What's going on? Because you failed to recognize it was the hamburger, right? It was the garbage in the food, not the garbage. But the garbage is much more powerful and long lasting and sits there long after the burger's gone. So I think that's what amyloid plaque is it's really just garbage the brain's trying to push away. It's not in the nerve cell, it's in the brain, but it's trying to deal with the process that's been going on for 20 years, which we don't know what it is.
Got it.
So we have now drugs. Biogen did it first, and now Eisai, and they've got FDA-approved drugs that remove amyloid plaque from the brain incredibly well. I can't tell you how well these drugs work, and so in that sense, they're miraculous. But there are plenty of people who've been on them who A, never got any better, or B, got worse because in pulling out the plaque, you can get brain bleeding or hemorrhaging or swelling. You know, they're scary in that sense, but if you have the right case and the right situation, it might be right for you. And just to describe it, so we know now very well these drugs remove amyloid plaque, but on average, that only lessens the decline. So back to what Loris was saying of slowing, now we can say, because in these studies, we did study people's speed of descent, if you will. And so I tell people a lot of the time, it's like being in an airplane and you're at 30,000 feet, all of us are coasting just now fine and happy. But if you all of a sudden somebody tells you, well, you're actually at 28,000 feet, you'd be like, what? Or you're only at 25,000, it's like, what? I mean, you're still okay, but you know you're hitting Earth faster than the rest of us, and that's not very comforting. And so if these drugs could actually get you back to 30,000 feet, that'd be great. But all they did was remove plaque. And they lessened the decline of the descent by about 25 to 30%. So they did slow the decline. These now have been shown to do that. They're not curative, but they slow the decline at a risk. But then they can be, and some people, and we don't know who these people are ahead of time, but in our study, and I was actually the biggest study site in the world for aducanumab right here in Spokane, partly because of a lot of reasons, but we had 55 people in the trial, which was much bigger than most sites. And so I've seen a lot of people on the drug, and there are rare exceptions. And so I try to belittle these, but I have had people, I have one person who, on a test called the mini mental status exam, which is a simple to most of us test, but some people can miss a lot of questions that they never would have missed before. And it's a simple thing of orientation and spell world backwards and things of that sort. And she got down to where she had a score of 15 out of 30. So she had missed half the points, and she was completely dependent on her husband, who then left her, and left her now destitute. She got into this study. I can only tell you now, 6 years later, she's back working as a substitute teacher at Meade School of Insurance. So we have, and when we retested her, she has no amyloid plaque in her brain. And we caught her at a time before the amyloid or whatever else was going on caused damage. It was just causing damage at the time. So I have 2 or 3 or 4 people like that I can really say I know these drugs are curative in that sense, because we retested and she no longer has Alzheimer's disease. She would not qualify for a study today, even though she was at that stage. So we're excited in that sense, but then there's the other 90% who, these are very expensive drugs, and picked and chosen incorrectly. And again, that's why I think Medicare decided not to pay for the first one, because it would have broken the US budget.
Sure.
At what they originally priced it at $55,000 a year, plus 4 MRIs a year, plus all those doctor visits, plus the infusions. Excuse me, you multiply that times 6 million people with Alzheimer's disease, we would have literally gone broke in this country. And so you don't want to think politically when you've got a drug like that. You want to hope that it's the right thing, but it probably was the right drug for about 50,000 people, not 6 million.
Yeah.
And we probably could have afforded it, but not many people are trained in how to give the drugs. And the FDA doesn't really figure out how to do anything other than just approve it or not approve it. They figure doctors will figure it out, and that's really kind of silly. I think like most of us, I mean, I have no clue which chemotherapy to use for somebody if they had colon cancer. So why would they just FDA approve it and think I could do that? But they thought was that that's what would happen, and so it got delayed. So we're restudying the drug, and so aducanumab, even though it's FDA approved, it won't be paid for by insurance right now. We're restudying it to prove that that it not only removes amyloid plaque, but it does actually help people. Those are 2 different things.
Yeah.
Number 2 then, though, lecanemab just came out in July, June or July, and it's FDA approved, but it's an IV infusion every 2 weeks. It's only $26,000 a year, still 4 MRIs, still a lot of work, still a lot of challenge, but at least it's there, and for the right person, it's there. And then donanemab by Lilly coming soon, and all these companies are going to tell you why they're better than the other one. But I think they're all very similar. They're all at least taking away amyloid. It did reinforce this amyloid theory that if you capture the right person and you remove the amyloid plaque, you can make people better. But it's, I think, probably 10% of the people that are going to see that benefit. And so you've got to just pick your patients correctly and talk to them and counsel them about the likelihoods of whether it's going to be X, Y, or Z. And I think this is like early days of chemotherapy. And the first chemotherapy agents that came out commonly would kill people as fast as they were killing the cancer, and hopefully they would survive. It's still not much better than that, unfortunately. But to be grim and honest about the disease state you have and treating it appropriately is very important. So, and then the last thing is on the back. So we've got some good things that are FDA approved, but there's actually, I think, better things coming. Some of these might be it, but these are research studies, so I'm not going to say that they're the cure. But I do say commonly that the first person cured of Alzheimer's disease permanently is going to be in a research study. It's not going to just happen serendipitously out there. So I do encourage research. I always have. It's the only way we're ever going to get and move forward in this world medically. So I advocate for it a lot. I don't want to belabor it much more, and certainly take questions for as long as anybody wants to stay here, to a point. but I just wanted to say thank you for letting me come and share what I have. Hopefully it was helpful and not too much. It didn't overwhelm you or depress you, but I want to encourage people to, again, come in and see us as soon as they can, as early as they can.
Okay, so what's new that I heard you say today is that there now is a test to see if you have Alzheimer's or if you have this plaque. Up to then, it was just like an autopsy.
And they've been there. What's new about them is that they are being paid for by Medicare and paid for by insurance. And so you can get an amyloid PET scan. Again, what it's telling you is your degree of amyloid plaque you have in your brain,
Right.
which some people can have and be perfectly normal.
Right.
Technically, they have Alzheimer's disease, but they shouldn't be in a study because they're blind.
So here's my follow-on question. with the availability of this test, there's many tests for genetic markers and everything like that. Has there been a study of the psychological effects of getting that test and learning that you either have it or you don't have it on the well-being of that person going forward? Because I think there's a psychology and almost an expectation that's set once you realize you have this marker or this stuff. You know, how does that impact your life? Has that
Yeah,
been
no, I
looked
think,
at? Yeah.
I think that's why we stress repeatedly that we shouldn't do it for asymptomatic people. If you don't have symptoms, that would be not malpractice,
Right,
but
okay.
it would be,
Very helpful.
yeah, it would be inappropriate to test somebody and tell them they have something that may never affect them in their lifetime, because it
okay.
could take 30 years, and no offense, I could get hit by a car on the way home. So
Okay, that's
don't worry about what isn't coming. But no, if you have symptoms, and there's no other explanation for it, and you have a treatment for it. So that's the other reason insurance companies would never pay for these tests, because there was no treatment. So it's, if I knew I could find out I have prostate cancer, but they couldn't treat it, do I want to know?
Right.
So I don't blame insurance companies for not paying for it, but now, since we have treatment, insurance companies are now starting to pay for the treatments.
That's so.
I mean, for the testing, to prove you have it. And in research, they'll pay for it all. So they never worried, because they had to prove it. FDA won't approve their medication without making sure that we know that we were actually testing. Because in the old days, not in the, I say the dark days, but this is only like 4 years ago,
Right.
a study that said they took care of Alzheimer's disease was wrong half the time. In retrospect, now that we have the testing, half the people in an Alzheimer's trial 5 years ago probably didn't have it.
Got it.
That's shocking to most people. I mean, so that's why almost every statistic about Alzheimer's disease is really bad. Because it's trying to say that, well, we studied alcoholics, but we didn't even know if they drank or not. You know, I mean, half the people do in America, and probably half are probably drinking too much, but that's not a very good study. But that's the best we could do. So now that we have the data, and now we can actually test people, we realize how bad we were.
Great, thank you, that was very helpful.
Yeah.
Are you involved in any of the studies where people are compensated for participating, like WSU does?
I don't know exactly which study, but we list the WSU studies from the psychology department on our website, because they're not drug studies, and those are options for people. I don't think WSU is doing a study of a medication, but I could be wrong.
Yeah.
But no, of the studies I list on the back, you're not compensated, other than they pay for your travel to our center, and sometimes a meal. But what they do compensate is that they pay for all the testing.
Yeah.
So you don't have to pay, and it doesn't go through your insurance, but you're not really paid, because that's felt to be a little bit unethical to again
Right.
to pay people to
Right.
be part of it. I mean, because that's coercion almost, and so I mean, it's nice enough to be free, I hope, but
Well, to clarify, I just finished an 18-month study with WSU, and they did pay me, but they always came to the home to do testing up to 3 hours in a row, which
Yeah.
was really severe.
that's probably Dr. Schmidt or Edgecombe
Yes.
in the Department of Psychology.
Yes.
So I've been working with her for 30 years, and we co-author papers, but again, she doesn't do any drug studies, but she's done some really cool stuff, and I've been a co-author on papers.
Yeah, I just want to clarify
Yeah.
that, because
Yeah.
that's what I've been doing, but what
Yeah.
you're talking about is the other.
Yeah, they'll give you an iPad sometimes, they'll give you things, they'll come to you, that's all great, and I advocate that a lot. And again, because not everybody can get into a drug study,
Right.
and so, or want to be one, so it's a good thing to have, and it's a good thing to bring up. And it's on our website too, which you can get. And I should clarify too, Kingfisher is the research company, and Northwest Neurological is my clinical company. They're really the same, I mean, I own them both, but there was a legal reason why we had to separate them, and
Yeah.
so, if anybody has any questions. Sure.
Is there family inheritance, is it genetically passed through a family? Because
That-
my dad had it and my sister had it.
That's a very good question, and there certainly are cases, but it's about 2% of the time where actually you have a gene that's going to get you what we call dominantly inherited or genetically inherited, and that's usually in a family where half the people have it and they're under 65 when they first start getting symptoms. So if you might be, I don't know, but how many, you can do the math yourself, but most people have 1 or 2 family members out of the 20 family members they've had get past 65. And if you have 1 or 2 out of 10, that's not anything more than all of us. That's kind of like saying if I have a family history of gray hair. It's like,
It's
well,
hard to trace back because in the past, we always said senility, you know,
Yeah.
grandfather's old and so.
yeah, eventually things happen. The difference is that it's just that it's rarely that it's actually in a gene that we know of, genetically inherited. If you have a family history of a few people, you're more likely than the general population, but that's not that much more, and I wouldn't, again, stress too much about it. I mean, it's still there, but there are families that seem to have a lot more cancer. There are families that seem to have a lot more heart disease than their share, and just like this, there are families that seem to have more Alzheimer's, but we don't know how to really test for that, or what to do. Sure.
So how do you know, like, when it's time to come in? So I think we all have memory loss, we all have that. So when do you know it's something to come in for? Because it sounds like you could catch it earlier, but nobody's gonna come in because it's kind of hard to know. You know, so like, when would you know that it was a good time to, and does age play into that? Like,
Yeah, I think again, if you don't have another reason, so the most common reasons under age 65 why people have problems are usually because of depression, or anxiety, or sleep deprivation, or chronic pain, or medications. And that's a lot,
Yeah.
medications including alcohol. But if people can get rid of all of that, and they're still having a problem, and certainly if they're over 65, and certainly if it's causing them any slowiness, or they're just different than they used to be, that's the time to come in. Yeah, we want to see people as early as that, if there's no better explanation. Over 65, I could just not even tell you, I mean, thankfully, there are very few people under 65 who get the things I take care of, so.
so when they're older, let's say like in your 70s and older, like, is it the same or is it, I mean, because some of that, is it just age, is it just that, how do you kind of know?
I actually don't believe there is such a thing as age, as a cause. I mean, in the sense that I have a 92-year-old father-in-law and his hearing's bad. That's because he's used to work around small airplanes, all the time, but his vision's fine. I mean, his vision, his muscles, his hair, I mean, it's not perfect, but it's very subtly impaired compared to when he was 60, and the same with his memory. But his wife, yeah, there's no doubt. And so it's when it's changing at a rate faster than everybody you know, and or everything else that's declining. So again, a small amount of muscle loss or visual loss or hearing loss that's gradually changed since we were 20 years old. But yeah, when it's changing rapidly, and you can really notice it's the thing and you're different than everybody else you know, it's tricky if you're staying around a bunch of people who are having memory loss. But it's, it's sad. Yeah, I think there's it's a lot more common in one sense, but it's not gonna hurt to get tested. Sure.
What is, someone comes in to get tested, what is that process? Is it an all-day thing? Is it a several-day thing? Is it an hour thing?
It depends what stage you're at. So simple things, we have a thing called brain check, which is a memory test, kind of a road test, to see how you do on multiple areas. That can only take half an hour of a memory test. If you're not sure if you're really having significant memory problems, we have people that can do rating scales, they're called, where they can sit down with you and a spouse or a friend who knows you well, and in an hour get a general sense of what your opinion is of yourself and what the friend's opinion is, and do they match, and does it seem like there's been a change. We can certainly do MRIs and blood testing and other things to rule out what else it may not be. And then again, if you get to a stage where you want this more, yes, it looks real and you want to know, well then there are these amyloid PET scans or lumbar punctures, but I rarely order those outside of research, because like this new drug Leqembi that came out in June, even though I'm one of the bigger centers in the world for research, and Leqembi just hasn't taken off as much as they thought it would either. I mean, there just aren't many people who qualify for a really expensive drug that does carry some risks, and it does kind of glue you to our center. I mean, you have to come in every 2 weeks, essentially at this stage for the rest of your life. That's a big commitment, and I'm not sure a lot of people want that. I guess at this point I haven't found anybody who does when they hear the options, so. But anyway, it depends where you're at in the stage of what we would do. But no, I mean, if it was the first visit, it's just an hour to talk and figure out where you are, and then we can talk about what things there are available. But it's simpler, I think, than people think. It's not as complicated. Sure.
I'm full of questions.
That's great.
There can be emotional changes through the course of one's life. And I've seen emotional changes in, say, my dad and things like that in older years. And how do you differentiate, like, or is that something you study? Kind of your temperament or your we become less inhibited or closer to our emotions. And is that just being human, or is that something you have to kind of, there's a frustration level with some of these accommodations you're making to loss of ability? I was just wondering how the
Yeah.
emotions play into
No,
your
and
analysis.
you brought that up earlier, I mean, and I didn't mention, I said it very early on that, again, our mind's there as well, and literally right next door to me, I have a psychiatric nurse practitioner in my office,
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
and she
I
sees
missed that.
people for that as well. No, I didn't say that part, but,
Okay.
but we do, what I did mention is, again, how depression and anxiety are in the same organ system, and
Okay.
and early behavioral change can be the first sign of Alzheimer's disease as well.
Okay.
I didn't mention that, I mean, any early cognitive or behavioral change. I wrote memory loss because that's what grabs us,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and it's so recognizable, but it's really any change of your brain that has not been there before. So some people do start with depression and anxiety, and a 70-year-old person who has previously been very strong and not anxious and, emotionally strong, and all of a sudden is very panicky or very irritable.
Or close to tears a lot. This is what I
Yeah.
noticed in my dad, and he would just, his emotions would be on his sleeve.
And that's not just necessarily aging. I mean, your personality shouldn't necessarily change just out of the blue. I mean, if there's a if something has changed, there's probably a reason
Okay.
for it. If, again, I try and say this all the time to patients, but I'm not kidding, that our aging, if you will, started whenever we peaked. And I don't know what that was, but 20 or...
Not yet.
Well, maybe we haven't even peaked yet, but, I mean, in some ways, we get wiser, but we are, whatever. I think that, again, physically, I know I can't do what I did when I was 20, and so, again, it's why is it maybe the depression that I can't cognitively do what I used to do? No,
Oh, that's it.
but I don't look at it as a depressing, because there is a slight decline. So if I started out at, again, flying at 40,000 feet, and
Yeah.
now I'm at 35,000, fine. But no, if I'm at 10,000 feet, that's like, uh-oh, what's going on? And you would not know that, and I say that as the passenger in your own plane, you're maybe the last person to recognize it. And that's the
Oh,
other
that's so
thing, I
helpful.
think that, we're the pilots and we're driving around our family members and we know what really is their problem, but to point it out to them is mean sometimes.
Yeah.
But it's just if you're being honest and saying and compassionate, like, hey, this is a change and we've noticed it and you're doing it more than anybody else we know and we just want to see if we can't figure it out. But an early loss of orientation in a person who previously could drive through town as a mailman
Yeah.
and never get lost and all of a sudden gets lost in their own home, absolutely.
Okay.
Or so, it's orientation, recognition of objects, calculation abilities, but certainly behavior. I mean, anything the brain does, if it changes, and there's no other reason for it, it could be this. Sure.
A few years ago, when I was visiting one of our members who was in kind of early stages of Alzheimer's, she said that there was a shortage of neurologists in Spokane. Is that true? Is it hard to get in?
Yeah, I mean, we went from, when I came to town in 1993, there were 40 or so, and now there's 5, I think, taking new patients. I mean, there's others around. And more are moving into academic medicine and doing research. So at the University of California, San Francisco, I'm told there are like 300 or 400 neurologists in the Bay Area. And at the UCSF, I think there's like 70. I see more patients on my own than all 70 of them combined.
Wow.
So I mean, they are there and they are working, but they're not really seeing patients. So the number of doctors seeing patients in this country has, since COVID especially, plummeted in all fields. But neurology, like allergy and immunology and endocrinology and a lot of subspecialties of internal medicine, they don't pay a lot because they don't have a shtick. They don't have a little procedure or something that you can do, and so people just don't go into them. Neurosciences is one of the biggest majors in pre-med to get into med school, and then they get there like, I'll never pay off my student loans if I go into neurology, So it's just become less of a exciting. So people are going more into ophthalmology and dermatology and ER medicine, or things where they can have either a dedicated life and schedule or a procedure or an income that can afford their debt. I mean, it's really sobering in that sense, but at the same time, it's still a field that's growing, so yes, there are fewer neurologists, but fewer doctors.
Don't lose your memory, we need you.
Who are you? Carolyn's granddaughter and my daughter have been best friends since they were 2. I know it's we're not really being connected to the church, other than you might have seen me in the choir or hanging around. I seem like I know most people in the congregation, so it's been fun. But thank you. I don't want to hold people up, but certainly, I mean, it's 10:30. If people don't know, and you can stick around and ask more questions. Again, I'm happy to.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. Oh, and I have one last thing to say quickly. We're moving